There was a moment, sometime in the last 100 years, when the human diet stopped being written by the land and started being written by the laboratory. You weren't told this was happening. Neither was your grandmother. But if you look at what people ate in 1920 versus what they ate in 1980, the difference isn't just preference, it's architecture. The foods themselves were rebuilt from the inside. And the body noticed. In 1911, Procter Gamble introduced Crisco. It was the first fully synthetic fat designed for home use. Before that, people cooked with lard, butter, tallow, fats that had been part of human meals for thousands of years. Crisco was made from cottonseed oil, a byproduct of textile manufacturing. It was solid at room temperature. It looked like lard. It was marketed as cleaner, more modern, more scientific. Within a decade, it was everywhere. By the 1950s, butter was considered old-fashioned. Margarine was the future. It was cheaper, it didn't spoil as quickly, and doctors were beginning to say that animal fats caused heart disease. So people switched, not because they wanted to, because they were told it was safer. The same thing happened with flour. For most of human history, when someone ground wheat, they used the whole kernel, the bran, the germ, the endosperm, all of it. But in the late 1800s, steel roller mills made it possible to strip away the outer layers and produce pure white flour. It was softer. It lasted longer on the shelf. It became a status symbol. By 1910, white bread was the standard. The nutrients that had been in the wheat, the B vitamins, the fiber, the minerals, were gone. So, in 1941, the US government mandated that white flour be enriched. They added back a few synthetic vitamins. Not all of them, just enough to prevent obvious deficiency diseases like pellagra and beriberi. It was called fortification, but it was really compensation. And no one asked what else had been lost. Sugar used to come from cane, from beets, from honey. It was expensive, so it was used sparingly. But in the 1970s, Japanese researchers discovered how to convert cornstarch into a liquid sweetener. They called it high-fructose corn syrup. It was cheaper than sugar, it mixed easily into liquids, and because of agricultural subsidies, corn was abundant in the United States. By 1984, Coca-Cola and Pepsi had both switched their formulas. Most processed foods followed. High-fructose corn syrup doesn't just taste sweet, it behaves differently in the body than sucrose. Fructose is metabolized almost entirely by the liver. In large amounts, it promotes fat storage in ways that glucose does not. And because it was so cheap, it started appearing in foods that had never been sweetened before. Bread, salad dressing, crackers, soup. The average American went from consuming about 4 pounds of corn syrup per year in 1970 to over 60 pounds by the year 2000. No one voted on this. It just became the default. In 1960, the obesity rate in the United States was around 13%. By 1980, it had climbed to 15%. By 2000, it was 30%. Today, it's over 40%. Type 2 diabetes followed a similar curve. In 1958, fewer than 1% of American adults had been diagnosed with diabetes. By 1980, it was around 3%. By 2020, it was over 10%. These aren't just numbers. They represent a fundamental change in how the human body responds to food. For most of history, the body knew what to do with what it was given. Fat, protein, fiber, water, these were recognized. They triggered hormones that told you when to stop eating. They required effort to digest. They kept blood sugar stable. But the new foods didn't work that way. Refined flour digests almost instantly. It spikes blood sugar, then crashes it. High-fructose corn syrup bypasses the usual satiety signals. Hydrogenated oils, the trans fats used in margarine and shortening, don't just replace natural fats, they interfere with cell membranes, hormone production, inflammatory response. And because these ingredients were cheap and shelf-stable, they became the foundation of processed food, which meant they became the foundation of what most people ate. By 1990, more than half of the average American diet came from ultra-processed foods. That number is closer to 70% today. There used to be seasons. In winter, you ate what had been stored: root vegetables, preserved meats, fermented cabbage. In spring, you ate greens. In summer, berries. In fall, squash and apples, and whatever could be canned or dried for the months ahead. Your body adapted to this rhythm. It knew scarcity. It knew abundance. It knew how to shift between burning fat and burning glucose depending on what was available. But in the second half of the 20th century, that rhythm disappeared. Refrigeration, global supply chains, and industrial agriculture made it possible to eat strawberries in January and potatoes in July. Seasons stopped mattering, and with them, the idea that food had a context, a time, a place, a reason. Everything became available all the time. And the body, which had been shaped by millions of years of variability, suddenly found itself in a state of permanent summer. Constant sugar, constant availability, no rest, no reset. The metabolism didn't know what to do with that. In 1977, the U.S. Senate published the Dietary Goals for the United States. It recommended that Americans reduce their intake of fat, particularly saturated fat, and increase their intake of carbohydrates. The reasoning was based on studies linking dietary fat to heart disease. But those studies were not conclusive. Some researchers disagreed. Some pointed out that the populations with the lowest rates of heart disease, like the French, the Greeks, the Japanese, ate very different diets from one another, and none of them matched the low-fat model. It didn't matter. The guidelines were adopted, and the food industry responded. Fat was removed from thousands of products, but fat carries flavor, so when it was taken out, something had to be added back. Usually that something was sugar, or salt, or both. Low fat became a health claim, but the foods labeled that way were often higher in calories, higher in sugar, and less satisfying than the original versions. People ate more of them, not less. By the 1990s, the low-fat diet had become the standard recommendation from doctors, nutritionists, and public health officials. And during that same period, obesity and diabetes rates climbed faster than they ever had before. It was called a paradox, but it wasn't. In the early 2000s, trans fats were finally recognized as harmful. They were banned in some countries, phased out in others. The same margarine that had been marketed as heart-healthy for 50 years was quietly reformulated. No apology, no explanation, just a new version on the shelf. The same thing happened with artificial sweeteners. Saccharin was going to cause cancer, then it wasn't. Aspartame was safe, then questioned, then declared safe again. Sucralose was the answer, until people started asking about gut bacteria and insulin response. The message kept changing, but the instructions stayed the same. Trust the label, trust the science, trust the market. And people did. Because what else were they supposed to do? Your great-grandmother didn't count calories. She didn't read ingredient lists. She didn't need to. She ate butter, eggs, cream, meat, bread made from flour she could pronounce. She ate vegetables from the garden and fruit in season. She didn't snack between meals because there wasn't anything to snack on. Dinner was dinner, breakfast was breakfast. She stayed thin without trying. Not because she had better willpower, not because she exercised more, but because the food she ate still resembled food. It had fiber, it had water, it required chewing. It sent signals to her brain that said, "This is enough." The body knew how to regulate itself when it was given materials it recognized. But that feedback loop has been broken. Somewhere along the way, food became fuel. Meals became macro ratios. Eating became optimization. You weren't supposed to enjoy it too much. You were supposed to track it, measure it, adjust it, compensate for it. If you gained weight, it was your fault. You ate too much. You moved too little. You lacked discipline. The food itself was never questioned, even though it had been stripped, injected, hydrogenated, enriched, fortified, and flavored by people in labs who had never tasted it. Even though the ingredients were things that didn't exist 100 years ago. Even though your body had no evolutionary history with any of it. You were the problem, not the product. Convenience was sold as progress. Shelf life was sold as safety. Consistency was sold as quality. And maybe it was in some ways. It's easier to open a box than to bake bread. It's faster to microwave than to roast. It's cheaper to buy a bag of chips than a pound of vegetables. But ease has a cost, and that cost was paid in ways that didn't show up on the receipt. It showed up in inflammation, in insulin resistance, in chronic fatigue, in gut permeability, in autoimmune conditions that didn't have names 50 years ago because they barely existed. It showed up in the normalization of feeling tired after eating, of needing coffee to wake up and sugar to stay awake, of hunger that never really stops even when you're full. The body was trying to say something, but the noise was louder. If you wanted to understand what happened, you could look at the data. In 1970, the average American consumed about 2 pounds of cheese per year. By 2020, it was 40 pounds. In 1950, the average person ate about 2 teaspoons of soybean oil per year. By 2010, it was over 25 pounds. In 1980, the average child drank 1 can of soda per week. By 2000, it was 1 can per day. These aren't small changes, they're seismic. And they didn't happen because people suddenly decided they loved cheese and soda and soybean oil. They happened because the infrastructure changed, because subsidies made certain crops cheaper, because patents made certain processes more profitable, because food science made certain textures more addictive. The choices that felt personal were shaped by systems that were impersonal, and the systems were built to grow, not to nourish. There is no villain in this story, no single moment when someone decided to harm you. Just a series of decisions made in boardrooms and laboratories and legislative offices, each one reasonable on its own, each one optimizing for something other than your long-term health. Profit, shelf life, scalability, yield. The body wasn't part of the equation. And now, decades later, we're left trying to reverse engineer what food used to be, trying to remember what normal felt like. But the record is still there. In old cookbooks, in soil studies, in the health outcomes of populations that never adopted the Western diet, in the quiet, undeniable fact that something fundamental was altered, and the body remembers, even when we don't. This is what we were fed. Not just the substances themselves, but the logic beneath them, the belief that food could be improved by removing what had always been there, that health could be engineered, that the body could be trusted less than the label. It's only one chapter, but it's the chapter we're still living in.